Ethics and Society, Making Ethical Arguments, Part 3.
And now, on with the show.
Okay, let's jump right into Part 3, where we look at the ethical theories that are based in consequentialism. And we have 3 of those that we studied this semester: ethical egoism, act utilitarianism, which was from Jeremy Bentham, and rule utilitarianism from John Stuart Mill. Okay, so we'll go in that order. We're talking about smoking, and is the morally right thing to do to ban smoking? Right? Let's go to ethical egoism. What are the principles in this ethical theory? Well, it's a consequentialist theory, so it has the principle of consequentialism. The consequences of our actions are more important than the action itself. Right? So we can justify our actions through the consequences. We have the principle of utility. One should do that which maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering, unhappiness. Right? So there's our principle of utility. Right? We're going to justify all actions that maximize happiness and minimize unhappiness. Then we have the principle of hedonism, that happiness is defined as pleasure. Right? So what we're actually going to try to do when we put those 2 principles together is we're going to try to maximize pleasure in the world and minimize pain. Finally, we have, or not finally, actually 2 more. We have the principle of the hedonistic calculator, that we can go out and actually measure pleasure and pain to determine which will bring about more pleasure than something else. And finally, we have the principle of egoism, and this is going to only be a principle for ethical egoism. It's what distinguishes it from other consequentialist theories. And this principle of egoism, we could say, is that one should aim to maximize the happiness of oneself first. So when we look at the consequences of actions, the ethical egoist is only concerned with how it affects me, right? How is this going to affect my pleasure? How is this going to affect my pain? And once I know that, then I will be able to make a decision. So what are the facts when an ethical egoist is trying to put forth an argument? She would state all of these principles and then would say, okay, here are the facts that I'm also going to use in my argument. Well, there's really only one fact that matters, right? For the ethical egoist, it's, do I like smoking? Does it give me pleasure? That's going to pretty much decide. It's going to settle the question for at least that one individual. Okay. Some problems, some complications. How do we resolve an ethical debate, right, with other people if moral rightness is relative to each individual, right? So what gives me pleasure might not give you pleasure. So the ethical egoists are dealing with a situation where moral rightness becomes relative to each person. So when we talk about universally banning smoking, that's at odds with a theory that says everybody is going to have a different sense, a different conclusion about what is morally right or morally wrong. Okay, so if we accept ethical egoism, right, if we say all of those principles are true and we have a fact about ourselves, about whether or not we like smoking, would this justify the government banning something? Isn't this a theory that says let people do whatever they want, whatever makes them happy? So it seems like the ethical egoist is going to have to argue for anarchy, no rules, no banning. Okay, so I have not actually given you the argument. I'm telling you how to construct an argument using the tools, using the principles, and where to go. What kind of facts do you need for you to come to a conclusion? Okay, so let's move on to the next consequentialist theory. This one is act utilitarianism, and it's almost the exact same set of principles as the other one. And I will say that all of these different theories, there's many different versions, and each version will have a slightly different set of principles that it claims are true and tries to live by. So what I'm giving you here is sort of the bare bones. And some might say, well, maybe we could even shrink this down further. But I don't want to make it too contracted, too dense. So that's why I've chosen to stick with these. But okay, so act utilitarianism has the first four principles are the same as ethical egoism, but instead of a principle of egoism, it has a principle of altruism and egoism, right? So that one should aim to maximize happiness overall, me and everybody else, right? Altruism is everybody else but you. So here, everybody counts, and everybody counts equally. We could add in a principle of equality here. Okay, so these are the principles for the act utilitarian that they're going to use. They're going to present in an argument. What facts are they going to rely on besides these principles? All right, well, an act utilitarian is interested in the pleasure and the pain that is caused by our actions. So the action that we're considering here is to ban smoking. So we need to go and we need to do research and look for studies that measure the pleasure and suffering that might be caused by the cessation of smoking. And we have to look at everybody. So we have to look at the pain that might be caused to the smokers if we ban smoking, and we need to look at the pleasure that might arise in the non-smokers if we were to ban smoking. And we need to figure out how many people are smokers, how many people are non-smokers, and how much pain or pleasure is going to be produced in both these groups if we were to ban smoking. Right? I don't know if we have that study out there, if we've gone and tried to figure that out, but a utilitarian needs to know this, needs to know what that answer would be to come to a conclusion. And we need to compare that to the pleasure from not banning, right? So we need to compare what would happen if we banned smoking to what kind of pleasure is out there and what kind of suffering is out there right now with smoking being legal, right? And then we need to figure out which one creates more pleasure in the world. That's going to be the one we're going to have to conclude based on our principles and those facts. We're going to have to conclude that the action that brings about the most pleasure in the world is the right action. Okay, so that's act utilitarianism. There are some complications, things we need to consider. And one of those is that smoking is addictive. So cessation of smoking can cause an excessive amount of suffering for the addict. And feeding an addiction causes an excessive pleasure for the addict. That's everything that once you're addicted, that's you're just always craving and you need it. And it fills this incredible desire you have. So it becomes excessively pleasurable and excessive pain and suffering when you're denied your addiction. And because of this excessiveness, there's a danger that a small amount of people, a minority, due to the excessive pleasure and the excessive pain that might be produced, can outweigh the majority's annoyances with smoking. So this is a complication because utilitarianism and this act utilitarianism isn't totally set up to deal with something like addiction, right? It changes the scales. Okay. What about our third consequentialist theory, rule utilitarianism? Okay, it has all of the same principles as the act utilitarianism that we were just talking about, but it adds on two more principles: the principle of hedonistic quality and the principle of universality. So hedonistic quality, this is the principle: higher quality pleasures should be given more value when calculating pleasure, right? So not all pleasure is equal anymore for rule utilitarianism. This is from Mill. And the higher order pleasures need to be given more weight when we figure out what produces the most pleasure. And finally, the principle of universality says that we shouldn't just consider the act, right? So now we're not just considering the act of banning smoking and what would happen after we did that. We have to consider sort of the consequences of an action if it were universally practiced. So we're not considering banning smoking. What we're doing here is we're looking at if everybody smoked versus if nobody smoked, and which is the world that has more pleasure. Okay. So what are the facts for a rule utilitarianism? They're a little bit different than the act utilitarianism. The facts that we need to have to support our argument are studies that consider the effects from increased societal smoking or the effects from ending the industry, right, the tobacco industry, completely. So those right were our two options: no smoking versus everybody smoking. And we also need to look for facts, studies that ask smokers to evaluate the quality of the pleasure of smoking versus other pleasures in their life. And we really would only ask people who have smoked. So if there's someone who's never smoked before, they're not able to judge the quality of the pleasure from smoking against anything else. So those particular facts are going to help us when we're using our hedonistic calculator for rule utilitarianism. Higher order pleasures are worth more. Okay. Complications. Well, again, smoking is an addiction. So we may assign a very high quality rating to the pleasure of smoking due to that addiction. So people who smoke who are addicted might not give up any other pleasures, even if one might think they're higher quality, but because of that addiction, they'll give up almost anything to keep the pleasure they get from smoking. So this might assign a very high order to the pleasure that comes from smoking. due to the addiction. And another complication is that we're in the realm of speculation now when we talk about the consequences of getting rid of the tobacco industry, right? We don't really know what's going to happen. A lot of people will lose jobs. Do we know if they're going to get other jobs, if there'll be other opportunities? We don't really know. There's a lot of speculation that would then emerge and when we're trying to figure this out. Okay. So let's make some final observations. And first, ethical egoism. It seems like ethical egoism is going to say we shouldn't have any laws that ban anything. So ethical egoism as a theory, it doesn't seem like it would support banning smoking. What about act utilitarianism? Here, it really depends on the facts, right? We have to figure out what causes more pleasure in the world. Having smoking in the world or not having smoking in the world. If we can figure that out, right, we'll have an answer. And if it's the case that banning smoking would create more pleasure in the world, then we have an ethical theory where we can make an argument that the right thing to do is to ban smoking, right? But it depends on those facts. And third, rule utilitarianism. Again, it's going to depend on the facts. But we also here have possible moral justification for banning smoking, right? If we can find facts, put together facts that say everybody smoking will cause more suffering in the world than banning smoking, then we can justify, we can say the right thing to do is to ban smoking. So I haven't given you an answer, but I've told you based on the principles of these theories what kind of facts we need to find, and based on what we find, we have potentially an argument for banning smoking. Okay, that is going to conclude part 3. In part 4, we're going to talk about deontological ethical theories. So I will see you there.